Welcome to Nuanced Beauty. This podcast is intended to be a spot where my husband Bill and I will capture some complex thoughts and challenge us to hold to our opinions loosely so that we can see the beauty in others and the beauty in ourselves. I want to challenge us to dive deeper into those everyday topics and those sticky topics that we might shy away from, or we might bulldoze over others with our opinions. Because I think there's wisdom in this idea that if we all thought exactly the same, there would be no need for anyone else. So let's have a conversation and let's get nuanced. Hi guys, welcome back to Nuanced Beauty.
Hey everybody. Now, if you've been with us for a little while, you'll know that even though this podcast is about finding nuance in things, we've really steered away from the big haymaker cultural touchstone topics, the things that are in the news. We've
the more controversial topics that, like, if you just read a headline, it seems like your blood should boil for either in support of or hatred toward.
And this sounds like this podcast could be a platform to unpack the nuance in that, but frankly, there's kind of a million of those, and we just find it more interesting to talk about the nuance in everyday mundane topics.
Yeah, like I think that the intent here is that when you realize that most things have depth and are more complicated than meets the eye, it gives us the ability to actually build a bridge between someone who ultimately may hold a different opinion on topics, but when you can see the depth of something, you could be like, oh, okay, I see how you got there. And we also agree on ABC, but XYZ really stands out for us as different.
Yeah, and the thing we always want to point out is that the Venn diagram between any two people overlaps far more than it doesn't overlap. But in any event, as much as we've steered away from the big cultural touchstone topics, that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to steer a little bit into this. Now, if you haven't been living under, if you've been living under a rock, you might not know that the Supreme Court just handed down a 6-3 decision in favor of striking down affirmative action on college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Christina and I listened to a podcast called Honestly with Bari Weiss that had a great panel discussion on this. And we thought we'd share some of our thoughts on this.
Yeah. First off, go check out her podcast if you haven't, because there are 3 folks who are all lifetime lawyers who actually pay attention to law and read the opinion papers. And
there's a whole subculture out there of Supreme Court watchers.
Yeah.
That's like their own like little clique.
Yeah, and they're very aware of those topics. Like, they can just go way deeper into it. And so I really appreciated listening in to these 3 lawyers who I would say they were all 3 kind of on the left side of the aisle.
Yeah, they were selected
accurate?
Because there were some things that they disagreed on, so that made the conversation interesting. So they varied from left of center to further left of center.
Yeah.
But they did there was some nuance to their points.
Yeah, and it was actually I was going to point out, like, at the top of this, that even though all 3 were quote unquote on the left or progressive side of politics, they each had a different subtlety in their take on things. And when you get into the box of like, oh, well, you're on the left, or oh, you're on the right, so you must think this, it's nice to take a minute and hear that
there's more than the binary.
Yeah.
I really found one of the people, and I struggled because it was 3 female voices and 1 male voice. I struggled to figure out who was speaking sometimes.
Oh, gotcha.
But one of the people at the end, they asked, was this a good decision or bad decision?
Uh-huh.
And one person said bad, one person said good, and one person said
correct.
It was the correct decision.
Yes.
Which is a very deliberate phrase. So just to give us some broad strokes outlines, if you haven't paid attention, if you have, skip ahead 15 seconds. So what the Supreme Court ruled was that race could not be considered when judging someone
during
for application.
The application process.
Right.
But they also, another component was that race cannot be considered, but you could bring up your race as like how your struggles in life. And they really dug into the topic of diversity and diversity of thought.
Yeah, one person made a very strong, strong as in like she was emphatic, not strong, so that was a good point. She made a very emphatic point about how it is a absolute good for there to be a diversity of thought and opinion on campus, which is why we need a more variegated group of racial identities on campus.
And then that is where I think like Bill and I would like kind of expand, and I guess maybe our subtle rebuttal or our addition to that topic of what is diversity, which I think was her original question. What is diversity?
Yes.
And we felt like that fell short on the definition of diversity, because race could be one component, but
I think it's a good definition of diversity. I think race makes a poor proxy for differences of people's opinion.
Different opinion, yeah.
And to say that colleges value differences of opinion is laughable.
Yeah.
Considering what
we've seen in the past decade plus
about specifically conservative voices. And I worked at a university for some time, and I saw that there was not a heterogeneity of opinion. Like, you towed the line or you were getting canceled. Like,
yeah, it was a very clear, like, we want to promote this particular opinion on most stances, and it's not really diverse in thought. And that's where the Coddling of the American Minds is like an awesome book, because it dug into politically speaking how colleges are traditionally more artsy, liberal of thought, right?
Yeah, it was politically left. I think is the most accurate way of saying it. And they actually drilled down into data from self-reported surveys of how many people would self-report to being more conservative, and how that number has declined sharply.
Yeah.
Since World War II. World War II is the big inflection point. There's a bunch of people who came back from the war, got into teaching, and there was no follow-on generation.
And as they retired and such, they weren't replaced by other conservative thinkers.
Right. And can I get sexist for just a second?
Go ahead.
Bill Cosby had a great joke about women don't want to hear your opinion. They want to hear their opinion in a deeper voice.
In your voice. Yes.
That's what the joke was. And I feel like these kind of progressive white leftists who are saying they want a difference of opinion by bringing in different racial minorities aren't actually looking for a difference of opinion. They're looking for their opinion in a different dialect of English language. Like that. So to say that there is a desire for diversity, it falls short considering what is evident on college campuses.
Yeah.
And the other issue I have with the comment isn't that I don't think diversity is a good thing. Like, we started this podcast on the thesis that we actually really enjoyed talking to people who we disagreed with and learning things and struggling against.
Yeah, and finding what we believe better, because we have heard people of different thought.
And it's really interesting. And we've heard people of the same thought and thought they were kind of douchebags. So we actually kind of enjoy having diverse thoughts, provided that you could have conversations civilly. But the issue with taking this in a legal matter, and this is, I meant to say this a little closer to the top, the majority opinion on this case was saying that there is not legal standing to make a binary decision that one group of people gets treated one way and one group of people is treated another. That goes against the 14th Amendment. There's not a legal definition here that they can enforce.
And what is the 14th Amendment?
The 14th Amendment was the Equal Protection Clause, or Equal Protection Amendment. I haven't read the entirety of it, but it's the you can't be racist amendment. The minority opinion, on the other hand, took the stance of, but racism is bad, and we've had a lot of racism in our country, so we need to do things to help give people a leg up, which is called legislating from the bench, which is generally frowned upon. Like, the case at hand was, can you make decisions based solely on the basis of race? And the conservative majority said no, you can't. And one of the best articulations I've heard to rebut the minority opinion was, where is the end point? We had 400 years of slavery. Do we need to have 400 years of an overturning of
slavery by
some proxy? And this person was a little more controversial saying to white people need to be slaves for 400 years. Is that how do you make this even?
Yeah.
You can't make it even.
Well, and that's where I think we had a really great sermon one Sunday recently that talked about the point of law and morality and the Constitution. And it brought up this idea that, like, even the people who wrote the Constitution knew that it would not stand if people were not moral. And what is morality? Like, that's a different component. Like, there has to be a shared belief in humanity that allows for morality, and law cannot make people moral. So that's where it gets hard and a little blurry when we try and use legal law like definitions to create morality. Morality comes from the individual.
And the conservative majority of the court is looking at things from a legal perspective, being a court that makes sense.
Yeah, and I loved, like, they made a point in that podcast about, like, well, if you want, like, the Supreme Court can only function in this way. So Senate, Congress, President, if you have, concerns, why don't you go get proactive elsewhere? And I loved that there was a component of, like, I don't know, Biden saying something like this isn't
court ain't normal.
But I loved this one gal's take of, if you're referring to the fact that for the past like 15 or 20 years, the more left side has gotten used to the fact that the court has done things in our favor and it's been the way of progress toward our goals, then yeah, this isn't normal. We're going to have to all of a sudden like do things differently or something like that.
Yeah, I didn't get to that part of the podcast because I actually haven't finished it.
Okay.
I finished the portion on affirmative action. This podcast goes further because there's been a number of Supreme Court cases to talk about some others, and I didn't get to those yet. So we'll keep at least a topical discussion on the affirmative action case, but I didn't hear that part.
Yeah, and like the idea then, of course, like another person said, like, if the normal means that like they did something wrong or like they acted incorrectly, one of the other people gave a great like rebuttal about the number of cases that have been heard and just how diverse and just how not party line all of the cases in this recent, term of the Supreme Court. I don't know if they go by terms, but just how many varying cases and opinions that have not been like perfectly party lined or whatever.
Right. So the way the court works, I think, is there's times that's in session and not a session, just like any body in the government. And I think anytime a justice retires because they serve for life, you have a new group of 9 people essentially. Not all 9 people are different, but one of those people is different, so the composition changes. So you defer to that court. I think.
Okay.
It's either that or it's just defined by who the Chief Justice is.
Okay.
But I think this is how the House of Representatives works. We're on like the 450th House of Representatives because every 2 years it changes.
It's a new, potential.
So it's essentially a new Congress. They asked the question in this podcast about one of the issues that is in this conversation is, and you can see it in the majority and minority opinions, when people are disagreeing, they generally aren't talking about the same thing.
Yeah, that was a great point.
That was a really great point they made, because the people who are against affirmative action are making the point that it doesn't solve racism to add more racism.
Yeah,
and there's no way to legislate or through judicial action prevent racism. That's just not how the law works. The law has to be colorblind because the Supreme Court of the land has to look to what the ideal of the Constitution meant. For as much as the United States hasn't always lived up to that ideal in ways that I think the people on the conservative side sometimes fail to acknowledge, that we have not lived up to that ideal, but the ideal is still good.
And then, so they're coming at it from, here's how I interpret the Constitution, and then
these definitions that we're using for diversity just aren't legally defined terms. So you can't say that we must have diversity legally because you haven't defined the word.
But then the other interpretation
is, yes, we have done all of these very racist things in our past, and it is the right thing to do, legally or otherwise. It is the right thing to do.
Like, given our history,
to try to help underrepresented groups.
Yeah.
And that might be the right thing to do. my opinion is just it's not supported in the it's not supported in the Constitution.
Yeah, and then I think the next like component of what makes it like difficult is going back to that word diversity and what that means, and if it's tied to like race alone being what makes someone diverse. um I guess I can't recall what it was written in the opinion paper, but it sounded like they, like I said kind of earlier, that they were okay with you sharing some details. And so a component of their conversation was how this will be concerning, that it will be more ambiguous on what the application process is. And the way that they determine who gets in or doesn't get in is going to be
The victimhood Olympics.
Well, victimhood Olympics, yeah, that was a hilarious
That was a
part.
great term.
But it will also be under the table. Like it will become more ambiguous and more covert exactly what is going on and how people are determined, like what their personality score is, or whatever the
personal score.
And
they discussed this in some places. Affirmative action's been outlawed in California since the 90s.
Yeah, or 80s.
It was the 80s or 90s.
It was something with a six. Like a while ago.
But the dean at Stanford made a comment like, yeah, no, we aren't allowed to hire or to admit based on race, but we all say that is something that's important to us, and we just have to be careful how we word things. Meaning, yes, we are admitting and or hiring based on race. We just don't put it in writing. We still put it in writing.
Yeah, we just
so it just increases the opacity
based on how your paragraph is written. That you are.
But I think the case the court was trying to make is that if you as an individual say, because of these experiences I had, now I feel this way, or now I can do this thing. I've overcome this adversity, therefore I'm very strong at this. They made the point in the podcast that a person who had a 1350 on the SAT because they had a great guidance counselor and a great tutor and SAT prep classes that got them the 1350 is not the same student as the other kid who got a 1350 with none of that
guidance,
and a job on the side, who worked hard to get there. Not that both kids didn't work hard, but their starting points were much different. So you can say those are two very different students. And how do you tell those things? Well, that's where the essay comes in, and that's reasonable, because that is about the individual, not about the group that the individual represents. And we are an individualistic country. I herald and applaud the individual who stands up and says, I did a thing.
Yeah, but then test scores, like that's the component, is like, do we just throw out the baby in the bathwater? Like it's this weird tension that we hold of like, we acknowledge that things are not fair, but at the same time, like we don't want to rank people. But culturally, we have always been a hierarchical society, because you have to concede and you have to succeed in different areas, because that's how everyone contributes.
My mind was blown by a high school science teacher I had, who I've talked about on this podcast before, Mr. Strand being so influential, when he talked about the world is a bell curve and everyone gets to a different place at the ladder at the end. And the point of public education is not to get us all to the same rung, because we aren't all equipped the same way. The point is to get you as high as you can get as an individual. Now,
but then, okay, so like that takes the whole next, goes back into our idea of like, what do you think makes you actually successful? Like the idea of going to college, I mean, it equips us. I mean, we got degrees and it definitely equipped us to do our jobs. And we have a network of people that we could call on and like you as resources, as friends, as colleagues, as intelligent, like, like help us professionally, right? But
is it definitive? And statistically it is. Maybe not categorically, but statistically. It is a predictor of later success. But going back to tests though, I think you could say about tests what people say about capitalism, which is that it's the worst way of doing things in the world, except compared to everything else. So it's not ideal this testing because not everyone's good at tests. And coming from a teacher, I hated giving tests because I thought it was a very poor way of assessing if someone actually had mastery of the topic.
Yeah.
Because there's so much baggage that goes along with tests.
Well, and I definitely was not. Like, I wasn't an expert test taker.
And
like,
I was an outstanding test taker.
Yeah, you did great at tests, but you're like, you're
not good at anything.
Last minute procrastinator.
Oh,
and I am like a gung ho, all out effort all the time.
I was the one who passed our license exam on the first try, and I had a GPA a full point lower than you, I think.
Probably.
I think so. I wholly see the flaws in tests as an application yardstick. I don't know something better. I'm open to something better, but I don't know what it would be. So we talked about race as a proxy for trying to get differences of opinion. I think income striations make more sense because
and also
they talked about this. Like the wealthy black kid has more in common with the wealthy white kid than the poor black kid. The poor black kid has more in common with the poor white kid potentially.
Yeah,
I don't think that's 100% true because the poor white kid, if he leaves that neighborhood, doesn't take it with him, but the black guy never stops being black. So you can change your social class. He can't change his race.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
But I think it's closer to just than grouping people by strictly racial categories.
Yeah, but then there is also like the component, which I guess would be totally muddier now, but affirmative action and your gender, right? Like, I mean, we could go back to in college. I don't even remember what I said. You probably remember better than me, but like, how we became like officers of the regiment, and like when you consider that there was only 10% female on our campus of 300, like there were 300-ish and there were 30-ish or 36 women. So there
were 6 engineers.
And there were 6 female engineers.
There were 6 female engineers.
The rest of them were on the deck side with me. But like the number of office billets that females hold, like almost all the females were officers. So it's like that's not 10. If it's 10% gender, and then we're all in office,
overrepresented.
Like, yeah, potentially like overrepresented for the stats. But how like this kind of shows my cards a little bit. But I was very bothered by this concept of here, let me throw you a bone because you're a female, so you can get a leg up because you've traditionally not had a leg up. To me, that's insulting. And I take, like, I'm like, no, I am either qualified or I am not. I earn what I earn, and I'm not a fan of being pandered to. Is that the right word? As a female? Like, and that is, for me, that is how I interpret. And obviously this is gender and I'm not talking about race, so I don't think it falls perfectly into this analogy, but I can't help but in my own experiences be bothered by someone potentially giving me a leg up because I'm a female. So then people around me having the ability to assume that the only reason why I'm in this position of power is because I am a female. And I would assume that someone of a different race would be just as annoyed by that sort of opinion. But you can't solve that with the law.
Yeah, I think any affirmative action process is ultimately self-defeating because you get what's called the soft racism of low expectations.
Yeah.
So everyone around you assumes you couldn't get there without this.
Whether it's
because
true
that's
or not.
explicitly said in the policy.
Yeah.
And so it undermines anyone's confidence in that person as a leader. Now, I remember you gave the commandant an earful about that in front of the whole class, which was great.
It was just hilarious because I barely remember the details, but I was so bothered by it.
I don't remember what you said either, but I remember, because, this we don't need to get into those details, but we had a meeting with the whole class, and the commandant is explaining some things, and you stood up in front of the whole class and gave him what for. Now, you got a high level regimental position that you applied for and you deserved,
I think, but I don't know. Like,
well, you at least let me scale it back. You got a position you applied for. I know at least 2 people who got high level regimental positions that they did not apply for. Because they were women. And I talked to them both about it, and they're like, yeah, I remember, like, I made an offhand comment to the superintendent at a gala that, he asked me if I wanted a position, or if I wanted a position, which one it would be. And I'm like, oh, I'd like this one. And then How surprised was she when her name was on that list? Because she did not actually apply for it. She said something polite at a social event because it would have been rude to tell the superintendent, I don't want to do that.
I'm not interested in doing anything.
So that would have been rude to do. So she made something up, and lo and behold, she got the position. That happened with both of those people I'm thinking of. And so that just shows and we all knew that.
Yeah.
Now, fortunately, the positions that they were in weren't incredibly influential positions. They were high level in name only, but the point was that made every woman look bad. It looked like they didn't deserve what they earned.
Yeah, potentially, because it puts just a bad taste in people's like mouths. It's an unfortunate thing when trying to help promote someone up, but doing it in a way that is questionable, or it's just not, I don't know. Yeah.
So I'm being very critical of affirmative action as a policy, and I'm pleased with the court's decision in broad strokes. I don't know how to make the world better. I know that judicial action probably isn't it.
Yeah.
Which is why, kind of kicking this, essentially this kicked it out of the courts, saying, no, you can't legally do this. Figure out how to be just on your own. That's essentially what the conservative court said on a number of opinions through this year.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that America hasn't had its issues with race, that we haven't lived up to our ideals, and that some action should be taken. I don't know what that action is. I know probably the government's not going to be the one to solve racism.
Yeah. But so there you have it. There's our controversial coverage of a current topic.
Yeah, and if you're interested in listening to someone way more educated on the topic than us, I again can't recommend enough the Honestly podcast with Bari Weiss. They did a really great job breaking
getting into
down
more detail.
Yeah, the actual legal details of it a little bit, and they were much more educated take on it than ours is.
But until next time,
stay nuanced.
Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and in the spirit of nuance, I hope you found something that you could agree with and disagree with and still choose to lean in. If you're liking the show, please follow us and share it with friends and leave a rating and review. Until next time.